Thank you very much. I've entitled this "Challenging Intergenerational Inequalities" in order to meet the topic of the day. Unfortunately, for those of you who are here to listen to David Willits, it's quite a lot I'm going to say you will remember from what David said earlier this morning. They are slightly different charts, but they are basically the same story. So I will try as I go through them to add a little bit of flavour about other things as we do it. But what I've tried to do here is pull out some of the pieces of work that went into the Challenging Inequalities book, which was very much a co-production with a number of other authors at the IFS and far beyond. Pull out some of that which is relevant to this topic. The book itself, do go and buy it. It's marvelous, and covers a little bit of description about what's happened to inequalities over the last 30, 40 years, but then really goes into quite a lot of depth in particular on particular issues around the sort of ethical and philosophical questions. Why do we care about inequality? Talks quite a lot about the role of families and education. Then about how work and earnings have changed over the last 30 or 40 years, and particularly focuses on the impact of the last 20 years of stagnation when layered on top of the huge increases in inequality we saw during the 1980s. It then goes on to look at the impacts of all of that on wealth and health, and to some extent on politics, before drawing out some high-level policy conclusions. So that's broadly what the book does, and I thought I'd fill in some of my time now by telling you that rather than just repeating what you heard earlier. As I say, definitely worth the 20 quid or whatever it is that Princeton University Press are charging. So you're no doubt very familiar with this by now. Inequality in net household income has not shifted in 30 years. The yellow line there is the 90-10 ratio. Actually, if anything, on that measure, inequality has fallen a bit over that period. And the Gini really hasn't changed. So nothing much to see there. Now, if you delve into that, you'll see that until 2008, the top 1 or 2% were pulling away. But since 2008, even they have been hauled back in to some extent by the rest of the distribution. And yet, concern about inequality has grown really quite substantially over the last decade. And if there's one thing you can say for sure since 2010, it is that inequality on pretty any measure, certainly of income, has fallen. And yet concern among all generations has increased, and particularly increased among the youngest generations. So in a sense, I think what we're talking about today explains that. Whereas standard measures of income inequality haven't shifted, we do know that there is an issue about intergenerational inequality. Now, I nicked this chart from The Economist, I think. I think it's a rather nice way of showing some of what you will have seen many times before, which is the slowdown in growth over time. What it's measuring is taking year of birth, as you can see, from 1949 up to 2007, for people born in that year up until this point, what has been the average increase in GDP growth over their lifetime. And you can see it's on a sort of a gentle downward trend, and then a very sharp downward trend from 2000 onwards. Now, of course, for all of the later generations, the last couple of decades are included in that, but for the most recent generations, it's only the last couple of decades. Yes.
Is that?
I think that's not per head. I mean, I have many charts which show it per head, which in a sense is a fairer description. It looks worse on a per head basis because, of course, the population has been growing in recent years, and if you look at GDP growth over the last 20 years, it's significantly stronger than GDP per capita growth over that period. So even just doing it on GDP growth, you can see that that very striking downward trend. And as I say, I've used that because that's a slightly different way of showing something that I've shown in many other ways over time. So that has been a very different experience of the economy for more recent generations. And I think one of the reasons, an obvious reason why we are increasingly unhappy with our lot and with our political masters. Now, this is very much similar to what David was showing, which is showing the lack of generational growth in wages. So you take people born in the 1910s, towards the end of their lives, you see their income going down, but people born a decade after had higher wages, decade after that, higher wages, decade after that, higher wages, decade after that, higher wages. Born in the 1960s, higher wages than the 70s. Born in the 1980s, and it's beginning to dip below the previous generation. And if you put the 1990s on top, that is below right at the beginning. So you've got that lack of generational growth. There we are. There's the little bit of the 1990s. So no generational growth in wages. And then this remarkable, different again, to repeat the message from earlier, astonishing catch-up in pensioner incomes. This is showing median pensioner income as a fraction of the non-pensioner median, and you can see it hit 100% in around 2010, and it stayed there. Now, one of the themes I think here actually is David earlier said it's taken us a long time to catch up with the idea the pensioners are no longer poor. I think it's also, I mean, we also need to catch up with various other things that a lot of what I'm describing in terms of this intergenerational change, it all happened 10 or 15 years ago, and a lot of it has flattened off. We even got a little bit better over the period, over 10 or 15 years. So we're almost playing catch up. People talk a lot about, I'm going to talk about housing in a minute. People worry for good reasons a lot about house prices and home ownership and all of those things. House prices have been coming down significantly in real terms for quite a period. You can see the pensioner income stopped rising faster than everybody else's more than a decade ago. So these are changes which I think they didn't creep up on us, did they? But we sort of, and David noticed them for most people, but these are things that have been with us for some time and are actually no longer, on the whole, getting worse. What is getting worse is a longer and longer period of stagnation in incomes. So what we've seen is crucial here, I think, in understanding second aspect of why we're worried about inequality is that wealth has become much, much more important relative to income. In particular, you can see it starting to take off in the 1980s and really again taking off in the 2000s, and if anything, actually flattening a little over the last decade. The key thing here is that wealth inequality, as usually measured, really hasn't grown over the last 30 or 40 years. But because there's more wealth, it's harder and harder to save your way or earn your way up the wealth distribution. So some other colleagues at the IFS found that the amount that you need, the number of years of earnings that you need to save to get from the 50th to the 90th centile of the wealth distribution doubled, I think, from something like 10 to 20 years. You could say your income 10 in the 2000s, it was taking you about 10 years to get from the 50th to the 90th percentile. It now takes you about 20 years in that bizarre world in which you could save all of your income. So even if the relativities don't change, the fact there's more wealth makes wealth more important and makes the world a less mobile place. And one of the themes, I think, of all of this is that this is not just an issue of an inequality between the current older generation and the current younger generation, but it's going to have consistent knock-on effects down the generations. If this was just a one-off thing that we're talking about, intergenerational inequality, where we've got one rich generation and one poor one, well, shit happens and some people are lucky and some people aren't. But the consequence of this will be felt through the generations because, of course, the wealth is unequally held by the older generation. Inheritance is becoming much more important for younger generations. So people born in the 1980s, as a fraction of their lifetime resources, inheritance will make up twice as much on average as it will for people born in the 1960s. So for people born in the 1980s, twice the inheritance will be, on average, twice as important as that was for people born in the 1960s, but it was incredibly unevenly distributed. Inheritances are massively unevenly distributed. So there's a very immediate knock-on effect to reducing the capacity for social mobility. So this increase in the importance of wealth, from which flows the increase in the importance of inheritance, again, from that flows a reduction in social mobility. We are moving backwards through the 20th century, as it were, where to a period where your inheritance, your wealth, was more important relative to your earnings than we got used to all the way through that century. Now, important part of this, and you'll be very familiar with this, has been a reduction in home ownership for those of working age, and you see that's particularly true for the younger groups. But again, you can see that sort of that slight tick up from about the middle of the 2010s. So we're talking about this now. It's just about moving in the right direction, but still you can see among that 25 to 34 age group, you've got a reduction in home ownership of about 60% to 40% over that 30-year period. And here's something I think is really important, which is that this is looking at income quintile for 25 to 34-year-olds, so that's across the bottom, and then you've got home ownership rates for each of those quintiles in the mid-90s, mid-2010s, 2010, mid-2010s, and 2022. So what's that showing? Well, I've got a big red arrow in the middle one. It's showing that because it is for the middle income people that you've seen much the biggest drop, from about 2/3 to, it was to less than 1/3, but it's now jumped up again to about 40%. Back in the 1990s, if you're a middle-income young person, you would have felt quite like a high-income young person, because you're all pretty high probability, a 60% plus chance of being an owner-occupier. Certainly by the mid-2010s, if you're a mid-income young person, you're going to feel much more like a poor young person, because you're all not owner-occupiers. And indeed, because social renting is no longer much of a thing for younger people, you would have been a private renter rather as your poorer colleagues would have been. I think politically, a lot of this matters politically, but I think that's one of the things that matters enormously politically. If you've got people in the middle of the distribution who have moved from feeling a bit like people up the distribution to feeling a bit more like people down the distribution, that's going to create political unhappiness. And we are all seeing the consequences of that playing out pretty much as we speak. And there's that growth in private renting. And that's one of the most striking differences of all. Partly it's down to the collapse in social renting, but it's much more for those younger generations down to the collapse in home ownership. And you can see there by the people are in their mid-30s, those born in the 1980s, about 1/3 of them were still private renting, and that compares with couple of generations before, about 10%. Now, some of that is good, I should say. Some of that is good because it provides for mobility across the country. It provides flexibility in a way that some of those other ways of other modes of tenure did not. But what you also see, and I haven't got the charts here, is that an increasing fraction of families with children are in private rented accommodation, and there is a very strong, and if you look at the work, I think it's by Christine Farquharson and colleagues as one of the inputs into the Deaton review, that they show that there's a very strong correlation between bringing up a family in private renting and measures of psychological distress and anxiety and uncertainty and so on, which have knock-on effects for the children. Now, that's a correlation. There are lots of things going into that, but there's plenty of evidence that creates issues of its own. So I think a key aspect of all of this is that wealth inequality or actually the importance of wealth, probably is a better way of describing it, is increasingly shaping society. Children's and parental wealth are more closely related than their earnings. As I said, inheritances are having a negative and a growing negative effect on social mobility. And I'll say a little bit more about some of these. Those with wealthier parents, they do better in education, they earn more, they save more, they get onto the housing ladder sooner. And there are big differences between regions and by ethnic group. And one of the things I'm not going to say any more about now is that this increase in the importance of wealth is one of the issues that's creating or preserving in aspic some of the regional inequalities that we have. It's extremely hard for poorer young people from outside of London to move to London, and we see increasing numbers of graduates staying outside of London and not getting graduate jobs, and that's that is partly related to the difficulty of finding accommodation at reasonable costs. And if you're not using your education in that way, you are losing out on an enormous set of opportunities in terms of your future, earnings. I mentioned ethnic group there as well, because whilst most ethnic minorities are doing much better in education than the white majority, and some are actually doing better in the labour market, though not after you control for education. Most of them are right low down the wealth distribution ladder, because wealth begets wealth. And if you're a relatively recent arrival in the country, you haven't had parents to build up that wealth. I mean, that is obviously an oversimplification. But if you look at some of the ethnic minority groups, and I think I'm right in saying that Black Africans and Afro-Caribbeans are here, half of them have zero housing wealth at this point. This is just to illustrate something which I think is quite important as we have this conversation in London. We're very focused on house prices. London is a very different place to the rest of the UK in terms of what's happened to the housing market over the past decade. So you can see that across the UK, the affordability ratio, house prices relative to household earnings, or the other way around, has doubled from about 4 to 1 to 8 to 1. But in London, it's at least tripled from about 5 to 1 to 15 to 1. And in other parts of the country, obviously, it's done less than that. I mean, that is itself related to reduced opportunities for those who haven't been in households that have had that benefit. Now, I think David Sturrock may have talked about this yesterday. But we know that those from wealthier households, children from wealthier households, buy their property earlier. So the top line is saying what fraction of, right at the end of that, what fraction of people whose parents were in the top third by wealth are owner occupiers by age 30, and the answer is about 60%. And it's much lower than that for those who were whose parents were in the bottom third. And I'm not showing the chart, but if you look at that causally, you still see a big gap. So even when you control for people's earnings, the fact of their parents' worth, if you've got the same earnings, two people with the same earnings, if you've got a wealthier parent, you're significantly more likely to get onto the housing market earlier. And not only that, you get onto the housing market with a bigger deposit and in a more expensive house, all of which snowballs in terms of how much that's worth later on in life. So again, this is evidence of that reduction in social mobility and the rather unhelpful advice I give young people when they ask me, which is choose your parents wisely if you can. So, I mean, this is again repeating that point. Really, it's if your parents are wealthy, you end up with more wealth yourself. You're more likely to be able to access the higher paying jobs and the higher paying occupations, and those occupations where you move up the distribution more quickly. I'm just going to present two charts just to illustrate again how this cascades down the generations. And again, none of this will surprise you, and there are a million different ways of showing this kind of data. This is showing you fractions of young people with particular levels of education by the time they're age 26. And that's what's what the second from the left bar is telling you, is that more than half of those from the most deprived quintile effectively have no qualifications or GCSE qualifications and below. And that compares with fewer than 1 in 5 from the least deprived quintile of state school students to fewer than 1 in 10 of private school students. And conversely, degree level, 70% of private school students end up with a degree, 50% of those in the least deprived quintile at state schools, and only 17% of those from the most deprived quintile. Now, this is from, I think that this is those who are 26 in 2016, so a little out of date in a sense, but the pattern is exactly as it is. So again, if you have those high levels of inequality to start with, it cascades down the generations. And one of the strong conclusions, if you want to call it that, of challenging inequalities is that those, as many politicians who say, I really only interested in inequality of opportunity, I don't care about inequality of outcome. Well, the more unequal the outcome, the more unequal the opportunity. It is meaningless to say that you are uninterested in inequality of outcome if you are interested in equality of opportunity. And as I say, there are a million different ways of illustrating this. I should have said, actually, talking about housing, in terms of thinking about what you do about this, David quite rightly said earlier on, well, clearly we need to build more houses. We need to make it easier to build houses. We need to think very, very seriously about the tax system for housing as well. And I'm happy to talk about that more. The only other thing I want to say about the consequences of inequality later in life, as it were, is this very striking chart, again, drawn from some of the work for the review by James Banks and others, which is why you've seen that education depends very strongly on parental background, but education is an extraordinarily strong determinant of your health. And indeed, it's a stronger determinant of disability than is age. So what's this showing? The top set of lines are the proportion of those with no qualifications who have a disability. And you can see that at age 30, someone with no qualifications has about the same probability of being disabled as someone at age 70 who has a degree. I mean, that is an absolutely astonishing relationship, and is I think one of the most obvious consequences of the inequality that we have, and the inequality that we have in parental outcomes flows through into education, flows through into everything else that happens in life. I wanted to finish by saying a few things about policy changes that we've made over time. So the collapse, and again, you heard a little bit about this morning. One of the things we actually, I think, hear less about than housing is how pension changes have dramatically worked to the disadvantage of the working age generation, from more than 40% of private sector employees, so well over half the total 30 years ago, were in defined benefit schemes. It's now less than 1 in 10, and that's the population as a whole. For younger generations, it's less still. Now, why does that matter? Well, in part because actually, and I know that people in defined benefit schemes never understand this, if you've been in a defined benefit scheme, if you're a pensioner in these schemes, you might think you've paid for it. You haven't. You've been massively subsidized by the working age population, because the cost of delivering these has turned out to be far higher than expected. And literally hundreds of billions of pounds of additional money have been put into these schemes over the last 20 years in order to keep them solvent. So that is another way in which the younger generation have very dramatically subsidized the older generation. Now, this is showing in yellow defined benefit, in blue defined contribution pension membership. And you can see the blue line has gone up very quickly as auto enrollment has come in. But you do need to take account of the fact that contributions to defined benefit schemes are more than 3 times bigger than contributions to defined contribution schemes. They're significantly more than 3 times as generous on average. So whilst that increase in the blue line is welcome, it in no way makes up for the reduction in the yellow line in terms of the amount of pension that people will end up with. And as I say, those people work at the moment have had to double fund their own pension and very substantially the pensions of their parents' generation. Second thing I think it's worth talking about is the extent to which public spending has been increasingly focused on the older generation. We've heard about the increase in spending on pensions, the cost of the triple lock, but actually an even bigger thing is the shift between education and health spending. Now, I started out in the IFS in the late 1980s when health spending and education spending were about the same. I don't remember anyone at that point saying, well, in 30 or 40 years' time, we'll be spending more than twice as much on health as we will be on education. But that's exactly what has happened. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that. We've had demographic change. Obviously, health becomes more expensive to deliver. Both of them, you'd think, were superior goods that we want more of as we got wealthier. But what we've seen is that education has not acted, at least in the public domain, has not acted like a superior good. It has remained essentially constant as a fraction of national income, while health spending has more than doubled as a fraction of national income over that time. And of course, the large majority of health spending goes on the older population. And that's before we think about social care and pensions and everything else. Minimum incomes for those over pension age have moved up dramatically relative to under pension age. So this is, again, just another way of illustrating how much more generous we've been to pensioners than to non-pensioners. So the blue line is showing the minimum income available to someone over state pension age. So that's essentially the pension credit, although that's now pretty much the same as the new state pension. That has risen, as you see that blue line, very significantly over this period, and the minimum income available to someone under pension age has barely changed, such that we've moved from a position where the worst off you could be as a pensioner is 30% better off than for those below pension age. It's now 150% higher than those below pension age. Now that has that is an obvious and really big statement of policy direction. We have cared a lot more about poor pensioners than about poor people of working age. It's also one of the things that makes one of the things we need to do, which is increase the state pension age. It does have a genuine negative effect. If you increase the state pension age, and there are significant numbers of people just below state pension age who are not in work, that is a big cost to them. So we need to think about how to increase the state pension age whilst not increasing the length of time that poor people in their 60s spend in poverty. Now, the answer is not to keep the state pension age where it is, but it may be to do something about this gap, which I think is one of the reasons why that's proving hard. The last thing I wanted to say is that we've also designed a tax system which is incredibly unpleasant to people of working age relative to those over state pension age. So if you're 67 and earn 30,000, you'll face a marginal tax rate of 20%. If you're 27, you'll face a marginal tax rate of 37%, including your graduate repayment, and obviously a higher rate than that if you're over the 40% threshold, as something like a quarter of people now are, and a higher rate still if you're losing your child benefit, and a higher rate still if you're in that trap between 100 and 125 thousand pounds. Why we have such low marginal rates for older people relative to younger people, I think, is a very interesting question. Now, my concluding thoughts are not in some ways particularly related to this intergenerational issue. The concluding thoughts are those that come from the book and therefore relate to this whole issue of inequality. So they're a little bit disjointed from what I've just said, but I thought they'd be worth putting up just to give you a sense of, as it were, the concluding thoughts in the book. Now, I've said some of these. Income inequalities of outcome and opportunity are inextricably linked. And I think that's why, even if you sort of think, well, as I say, some generations get lucky, some don't. When you get what you've got at the moment, which is a very high level of inequality among one generation and the next generation, particularly dependent on inheritance and the position of their parents, then that gets you into a horrible spiral. The second thing I think it's really crucial to say is that it's easy to come up with solutions, in inverted commas, to inequality, which say, well, let's raise benefits, let's raise taxes, even to the extent that that doesn't create economic problems. Actually, if you ask people on low incomes, they don't particularly want redistribution. They want decent jobs and the ability to make their own way in the world. And actually, there's some very good evidence of that. And if you ask people at different income levels, it tends to be better off people who are in favour of redistribution and less well-off people who actually, as I say, want to earn the money themselves. And that's particularly true when you look at regional and local inequalities. Third point that we, I think, conclude with is that when you're thinking about sort of bigger economic questions, you do need to think about their consequences for inequalities. I mean, you only have to look at where is the population when it thinks about immigration. It's not very happy about it, despite the fact that we think that's probably good for the economy, because we didn't think about immigration when thinking about the social and inequalities consequences. If we're going to act on net zero, then we need to take account of the consequences for people in doing that. If you look at the impact of the policies in the 1980s, which were good for growth, but have created bigger, did not deal with the the inequality problems up front. So you need to take that into account. Well, there's lots of inequalities as well, which we face, which are themselves, I think, the consequence of other market problems. So when you think of the inequalities between regions, and I was talking to David Tuckett earlier, we know that there are problems. You get into an equilibrium where it's hard to get more economic activity in particular parts of the country. Agglomeration is self-reinforcing, and therefore it probably needs intervention to get agglomerations going in other places. And you can see with the tech giants, I mean, they've been phenomenally good for growth and for innovation and so on. But when they themselves become monopolies with huge power, you need to deal with that as well. And the last point here is, it seems to me that a lot of our issues at the moment are created by the fact that we haven't had growth over the last 20 years. The median person in the 1980s kept voting for Mrs. Thatcher, despite big increases in inequality, because the median person was getting better off. The median person over the last 20 years is deeply unhappy with all of the politicians, despite falling inequality, because the median person is at best getting no better off. So actually lack of growth, and obviously if you've got no growth, then everything is a zero-sum game, and that's a really hard thing to deal with in politics. I don't think we're going to overcome our intergenerational inequalities, or indeed any of the others, unless we can get back to some form of growth, and we can have a separate conversation about the best ways of achieving that. And then the last points I wanted to make. Those are some insights. I mean, not particularly deep insights. What are the challenges we need to deal with? Well, I think the one thing we clearly need to think about in this space is that most of my working life, when we've talked about inequalities, and I think most people, when they talk about inequalities, think about income. It's clearly now housing and wealth that need to move to centre stage when thinking about inequalities. And there's one just one so obvious policy which would help with all of this, including growth, which is just to build an awful lot more houses. As I said before, we also need to sort out our disastrously bad taxation of housing policy. Big spatial inequalities are a particularly big issue. They're a big issue in themselves, but again, they create huge barriers to mobility around the country. They create huge barriers to social mobility. And I think even more dangerously, they create barriers to a single sort of polity, to political equality. And again, you can see that. We did some polling as part of the Deaton Review, and regional inequalities came out as the most important thing. I think people are most concerned about. And you can see where reform, whatever you think of their policies, they are getting their support from those areas of the country which are, in that phrase, the most left behind. And something I haven't really touched on, but is important in all of these contexts, is that I've talked about stagnation in incomes. We've also had a stagnation in life expectancy since around 2008, 2010, and an increase in inequality of life expectancy over that period. And it's pretty clear that that is a consequence of pretty much everything else that we've been talking about. And the last point, the political and social polarization I have mentioned. And that is me.
Thank you very much for a great talk. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Paul. That was great, and the health bit really resonates because that's where, as you were saying, a lot of people are feeling insecure and stressed, and that feeds directly into ill health. So it's becoming this self-fulfilling prophecy. So a lot of the suggestions that have been put forward today to deal with wealth inequality and to support and promote young people in finding ways forward have, I would say, directly or indirectly depended on the stock market and share ownership in terms of how that feeds back, whether it's trust funds or other ways of thinking about capital accumulation. And my concern is exactly the point that you're saying, which is around stagnant growth. Because part of the problem, you could argue, is that a lot of companies are prioritising paying out to shareholders, some of them slightly overvalued, to the detriment of investing so that we have higher productivity, which then creates higher wages and better jobs. And also, equally, there's got to have to be more investment in net zero. So I'm trying to see, is there a paradox here that we're kind of relying on returns from the market to deal with some of the problems we've got, at the same time that they are causing some of the stagnant growth, which then makes it hard to feed back into the inequalities? You see that, are we being too short term basically and not investing for the long term?
It's a good question. I mean, a number of things. I mean, the UK for a long time, both public and private, has had low levels of investment and higher levels of consumption than you'd expect, given that, and that, to some extent, we are reaping the effects of that. That's changed a bit, certainly from the public point of view. That's changed over the last 5 to 10 years, and it's at higher levels than it's been for a long time, less so on the private side. Is the lack of private investment down to a lack of capital? It depends who you talk to. I mean, I'm not completely convinced by the evidence on that. There's a huge international capital market. There's a huge capital market in
being used for investment.
Well, I think they're being used for investment where people see a return to those investments. Now, part of the problem, again, is that you may be in an equilibrium where you can't see the returns to those investments in South Yorkshire. I take that example again, because other people aren't investing there, and therefore you don't see that return. It's worth saying, I mean, levels of savings have shot up over the last 5 or 6 years, probably not. I mean, I think an indication of a concern, which is that people are worried about the future, rather than a sense that they see a lot more scope to get higher returns, and particularly savings in cash have shot up phenomenally fast. I mean, the cash ISA chart is almost unbelievable when you look at what's happened. What's happened to the scale of investments in cash ISAs. So, I mean, I find the question a very difficult one to answer, because as a sort of, in a sense, as a sort of a standard economist, I kind of think, well, there's lots of money out there. If the opportunities are there, people will be investing in it. But equally, there's plenty of people who tell me that that's not what happens.
Thank you, Paul. Very, very, very good presentation. Can I just ask you a couple of quick questions? First one is about unproductive GDP. I mean, what I mean is that when we went through the pandemic, we suddenly learned that quite a lot of GDP is really pretty unproductive. Driving to work every day when you could be working from home and actually spending much more hours doing productive work. But actually that doesn't show up, because you're spending less on transport. Do economists need to think of a new way of looking at GDP, which concentrates on productive GDP as opposed to unproductive? And my second question is to self taxes. Do you think self taxes are really justified, freezing tax thresholds which hit people in the middle so hard, but allow the wealthier to basically see a much more gentle rate of tax increase?
So, I mean, on GDP, I mean, GDP is clearly, in some sense, a strange measure, but it is actually a very, very good proxy for what we care about. I mean, GDP growth per head and real earnings have moved pretty much in lockstep, as has GDP growth per head and real household income. So yes, you can have an argument about, are we measuring it in the right way? But I'm pretty confident that anything which overall reduced GDP will be pretty bad news, and anything that increased it will be pretty good news. So we can have an argument about the sort of specifics, but I'm pretty skeptical of those who argue that the problem we face is how we measure it. On the issue of taxes, I think the issue is, so if you look at tax take over the last 20 years and you look at income, it's very clear that the group who, this may be beginning not to be true, but was certainly true until 2 or 3 years ago, the group where there's been big increases in tax have been the highest earners. So the average tax on someone earning 150,000 a year is much higher than it was 15 years ago, and the tax take from the top 1 or 2% has gone up a lot, even as their pre-tax incomes haven't. Now, what happened over the previous 30 years was that tax take went up a lot, despite a sort of falling tax system, because their incomes have gone up so much. So you've seen a continued increase, but the reason for the increase since 2008 is very different from the reason for the increase before 2008. So, and we've obviously got 60% coming at 100,000 cash terms. It stayed there. 45p rate coming at 125,000. That's been brought down from 150,000. We've got 2 million people as opposed to, I think, fewer than 500,000 being affected by those. So that's having a big effect. But two things. First, that is just beginning to change now because of the freezes in the lower thresholds. Secondly, it's worth saying, if you compare us to other countries, all other countries that take a higher fraction of national income in tax are taxing their middle earners more than we are. And the last thing I'd say is that you were referring particularly to wealth, and that is just a much harder thing to tax. Now, our system of taxing wealth at the moment is pretty bad. I mean, council tax is hopelessly out of date and regressive. Capital gains tax is forgiven at death and is not charged, is charged on inflationary gains and so on. Inheritance tax is hard to make work, but certainly doesn't work at the moment. So we definitely need to make those things much better than they are. And governments, and you can see why governments struggle. I mean, you try and get farmers to pay some small fraction of the tax the rest of us pay, and you'd think the world was set alight. So as soon as you try and do these things, it turns out to be politically quite difficult.